All right, everybody, welcome to another episode of The Brain. And today, because it's always my mission to try to bring some great entrepreneurs who are doing cool things and doing it in a way that I feel is really important. What I write about a lot, everybody out there and talk a lot about, which is ethically trained, ethically sourced AI companies. So I have Ben Gottdiener today from Narrativ, a company that I've known about for quite some time, but I haven't really checked in with. But Ben, great to see you.
Great to be here.
Thanks for joining me. I know that I just reached out very recently, so I appreciate you jumping on it.
Yeah, of course. Look, when it comes to talking about ethical AI use, you'll find that I'm always first to sign up for that conversation.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's great. And in the last episode, I had Gen AI on, and similarly, a similar kind of approach, ethically trained approach, which is, I think, great. So, Ben, first of all, we're talking about Narrativ, and tell me a little, for everybody out there who doesn't know about you guys, tell me a little bit about what you do, and then later on, we'll talk about your own personal journey of how you got into doing this in the first place. But go ahead, just kind of lay out what Narrativ is all about.
Yeah, so Narrativ is a SAG-AFTRA approved marketplace for advertisers to license talent, audio, AI likeness, and use it to make advertisements. So maybe like double clicking into that for 1 second. The way that it works on the advertiser side is they'll come to our website, find a talent or a personality who they want to work with. They can click into that person's profile, and then they can effectively hire them to make an advertisement. The way that that hiring works is they get directed to our advertiser portal, at which point in time they end up generating the near final ad copy that then gets sent to talent to approve and review. And if talent approves it, it can go live. And if they deny it, it never goes live.
So are we talking about likeness or, so
Yes.
not just voice?
We're talking about audio likeness today. I mean, we have aspirations to take on other elements of likeness, but we're starting with voice.
Okay, that's what I thought. Okay, so on the voice side, so I have not been through the customer experience itself, and then we'll kind of dig in a little bit more on the training of the AI, et cetera. But so you can have anybody who's a member of a union or not, anybody. So I could, if I wanted to, just sign up. And so how many people do you have already signed up to be the talent?
Yeah, so since we announced our partnership on the 14th, we've gotten something like 500 novel signups with 150 people who have fully completed the onboarding process.
Okay. And then an advertiser who comes onto the platform to use it, how do they sift through the 500, which will go up to 5,000 and beyond?
So there are a few ways to actually pick and choose who you want to work with. So you can filter based on price if you want to, if you're more price sensitive, but you can also filter on a few different components. So let's say, for instance, that I'm Nike and I want to license someone's likeness who's focused on the athletic space, right? So I could find someone on Narrativ who's potentially an athlete as opposed to an actor or a broadcaster or some other category, filter down to that level. And that'll be a subset of the total number of people on the platform. And then from there, I can refine that approach even further based on tags that talent has actually set out in the platform until I find the person that is perfect for my advertisement.
Okay. So take me through the whole workflow then. You have somebody, you already have the talent that's in the pool, and you kind of described how an advertiser like a Nike comes in. But take us through the workflow of a Nike. And I guess the first question is, why would they come to you rather than do it the old-fashioned way?
Yeah, so I'll answer the second part first, and then we'll go through the actual generation process.
Yeah.
The short answer is, look, you can generate ads much faster now versus what it would take for you to normally get an audio ad created, where you have to rent studio time, go into the booth, record it, find the exact perfect sample that you want to actually deploy. That takes time. It takes hours to actually get the thing produced, and then probably a couple days after to get it mixed, mastered to wherever you want it. Whereas our solution is ready to go within minutes, assuming that talent approves it for use. So that's part of it. And the other part of this is, look, the vision for someone like a Nike is we believe that talent have baked in audiences, right? So if I'm someone who's well known, I have a follower group already, and I might find that as an advertiser, if I pick someone's likeness to advertise to a particular audience, that audience might be best served between several different voices, right? So it could be the case that I'm able to achieve a higher return on my ad spend. So that's why Nike would use someone like us, because now they have the ability to experiment and find the ad that will resonate most with their end audience, whoever it is that they're trying to target. In terms of the actual workflow, so there are 4 main steps that an advertiser needs to take in order to complete an advertisement and send it to talent to review. So step 1 is detailing what your campaign settings are. So in this, you'll detail, okay, what type of advertisement am I creating? As in, pick the ad category. 2 is detail, okay, how long do I want to license someone's likeness for? What is the length of the ad term?
But again, when we're talking about likeness, you're talking about voice only at this point.
Voice only at this
point. But because likeness is, but it will be likeness afterwards at some point.
At some point, assuming all of our aspirations are met, exactly, it will be likeness at some point. But today it's audio likeness. So then I'm detailing from there, okay, what demographics am I trying to target with this advertisement? And then the type of advertisement, meaning audio versus video. Again, video is later, it's aspirational, but audio today. So that's all of step 1. Then step 2 is the actual talent selection. I can do this in 2 places. So I can do it direct from Narrative's marketplace, or if I'm already in the advertiser platform, which is where someone like Nike would get this done, I can pick talent at this step 2. And part of what occurs here is the selections you made in step 1 influence which talent you can pick in step 2. So just an aside for a second, if I'm talent and I don't want to work on any political advertisements, I can specify that in my profile. So if I'm making something like a political ad, I'll detail that in step 1, and it will automatically remove talent who have excluded that in step 2.
Got it.
Then step 3 is the actual ad generation process. So this is basically detailing what text do I want the end advertisement to say. I generate the ad in step 3. And then once I'm satisfied with that advertisement, in step 4, I pay for it, and it gets sent to talent to approve and review.
But the way that, like you said, you were talking about step 3, I think, with the text. So I'm Nike, I'm the one who write it, but I use essentially the voice bank, the approved voice bank. So the voices are, you're generating, using the voice, you're generating the voice matching the text. So, right? So the talent is not reading the script. It's just using their voice, and it's generating the based on the text.
That's exactly right.
Okay, that's what I thought. So, like Peter Csathy, I can have my voice in there, and I can be sipping my cocktails on the beach while advertisers are using my voice over and over, and I'm taking the ka-chings.
Correct. All you have to do at that point, once you're onboarded as talent, is review the incoming ad requests. And part of what we've done here is individual talent can review and approve ad requests. So in that case, the only thing you would have to do on the beach, Peter, is just open up your phone and make sure that incoming ad requests are taken care of. Or if you have an agent or a representative who tends to do that work for you and knows your brand relationships well, they can also take on that piece of work.
Okay. And so business model, how does the advertiser pay? How does the talent collect? And how do you get paid?
Yep. So the way that it works is the advertiser is the one that's paying for the advertisement full stop. How much they pay, there's a premium that gets added on top that would effectively be Narrative's fee, but let's use an example. So let's say I'm someone who's priced my voice at $1,000 for an 8-week license term, something to that effect. At that point in time,
let me stop you for a second. So 8-week license term. So I'm the talent. I've approved this message and what the use could be. And so the advertiser has paid for that period of time. So after one day, after the 8 weeks, then no longer can they use it. Correct. And do you have an enforcement mechanism of some kind?
So the way that it works today is we will email the advertiser and let them know that their license term has expired. So we'll call that out explicitly, and we'll give them the option to renew it if they want to extend that duration. So at that point in time, we'll also send them some message saying, hey, look, if you continue using it past this point, you take on full liability for using it beyond the license term.
Okay, got it. So continue on with the business model. Who gets what?
Yep. So the way that we'll explain this is, let's assume I have $1,000 is the price to license my voice for 8 weeks or something to that effect. There'll be a few premiums that'll be added on top, depending on if I am SAG-AFTRA or not SAG-AFTRA. So I'll go through SAG-AFTRA first, and we'll detail all the different add-ons. So one, if I'm SAG talent, is pension and health, right? So there's a 20.5% pension and health premium that gets added on top of the total talent price. So if I'm $1,000, then my net price now with that will be a little over $1,200, right? Narrative also takes a 10% premium. So add that on top, it ends up being $1,300. And then there are a few payroll fees and processing fees that get baked into there as well. If I'm not SAG-AFTRA, the biggest difference between those is that 20.5% pension and health contribution. So I, as the advertiser, will pay a bit less of a premium, something like 1.17 times versus 1.37 times if I'm working with non-union talent.
Okay, got it. So from an advertiser standpoint, it's going to be much more cost effective for them, much more efficient, and so the benefit for working with you is that now they can get exactly what they want. They can get several different iterations. They can tweak the copy of the text and just generate again. And if they're generating several different versions, does each individual version then ultimately have to be approved by the talent?
Only if they want to serve all of those versions. So the way that it works in the platform today is we have unlimited generation until you get to the final advertisement that you actually want to deploy. So if they want to deploy multiple advertisements, that's when talent needs to opine on whether they're okay with all of those ads that you've generated going out. But the actual draft versions, no, that's not required.
Okay, gotcha. Hold on 1 second. Just
no worries.
Okay, Cooper, come here. Everybody who's listening out there goes my dog outside. That's what happens when you're recording live. But there we go. Okay. So I got that part of it. So from an advertiser's perspective, it's all this flexibility that they get. It's going to be a lot more cost effective to them. From a talent's perspective, it gives potentially a broader audience for them to be able to use their talents and monetize their talents. And from you, obviously, you're building a business here that can scale pretty nicely if you're successful here. So, and then I'll get into some of the other sides, but I think I understand the business model. Now, tell us why, and the reason why I really noticed you and wanted to focus in today's call, I mentioned a little bit at the top, which is you have this ethically trained fundamental part of your story. And for everybody who reads my stuff and listens to what we talk about, you know that this is something that I feel very strongly about. As I was telling Ben before we got started, I've worn a lot of different hats. I'm an IP lawyer, so I understand the intellectual property issues, but I've been in the studios themselves, so I'm very much like in understanding the creative community, and I speak with artists all the time. But at the same time, I've also been a tech entrepreneur, tech forward media company entrepreneur, so I understand technology and not afraid of technology. But ethically trained in my worldview is that you have generative AI companies. Many of them say that they're training on publicly available data, and publicly available data without more typically means that it's on the full body of copyrighted works that are floating around on the internet. And we know that for like companies like Suno and Udio right now, which have admitted in their court papers that that's exactly what it is, that they train on tens of millions of recordings. So ethically trained means that the training for the AI is only on licensed content. So content for which there is there's consent and compensation. So with that little backdrop, Ben, so tell us a little bit more about how you came to your approach, and then feeding into the SAG agreement, which was just hot off the presses.
Yeah. So do you want me to go all the way back to when we first started Narrative?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I originally started Narrative with my now co-founder back in the spring of 2022. And we were going through a thought exercise at that time, trying to figure out what technology trends were going to affect different industries and how might they affect them. We ended up honing in on AI as being the thing that would probably be a fundamental change to several industries. And at that point in time, it appeared that voice cloning was about to turn a corner. It was already pretty good at that point, but it looked like it was about to turn a corner. And lo and behold, a couple months later, we ended up finding this open source model, which you can still find today, called Tortoise TTS. I don't know if you've ever heard of it, but Tortoise, which was originally put out by this Google scholar, I think his name is James Betker, it was the first model that allowed you to do really rapid voice cloning, like 30 to 60 seconds. Let me upload a sample and I can generate a copy of my voice. And I actually found that one of my favorite audiobook narrators was in the sample outputs. And at that point in time, it was a little bit of an aha. I knew that this was going to disproportionately affect talent. And originally, the way that we were thinking of this was, look, we wanted to generate novel audio content and then do the advertisements on top. That novel audio content was audio versions of newspaper articles. But we ended up just focusing on the ad creative side after focusing on that idea for a little bit. So when it came to the ad creative component of it, the big questions, which it started to appear at the time, were whose voices can we use and how can we use them, right? And that ended up being the most important question. At that point in time, we knew that we wanted to work with talent broadly to generate the advertisements because, again, we believe that there is an audience mechanism, right? So talent have an audience following. And so an advertisement in someone's voice should resonate with that audience more if I'm part of that audience. And so we ended up going and thinking through, okay, we know we want to get union backing, but we have to shape this thing first. So we ended up bringing on the former national executive director of SAG-AFTRA as an advisor for a bit. And he gave us a little bit of insight into how the Hollywood ecosystem works to a degree. And then from
because you're not from the Hollywood ecosystem?
My background, no. I have, if anything, a little bit of an ad bent, but previously, no, I've never worked as part of the Hollywood ecosystem.
Okay, understood.
And so he gave us some guidance on that front. And then after that arrangement was done, he ended up connecting us with some folks at SAG-AFTRA, at which point we continued to shape the product. So that connection occurred back in October of 2023 or so. And then it took 10 months to get to where we are now with a union agreement where we set minimum prices for SAG-AFTRA talent to license their likeness, along with defined license terms. And so we got to the end of that end of that process with them, and then said, okay, we know that this is going to be a big deal, so let's go ahead and jointly talk about this and why this is important, ethical AI use more broadly. And part of that agreement, which I think gets into some of the ethical training that you mentioned, is we had to agree with the union to make sure that all of the audio samples that were uploaded from talent never get used in any kind of training data. And so we've agreed to that with them, along with other stipulations around training to make sure that from the talent perspective, they have full control over how their likeness is used, which was the most important thing from Narrative's perspective.
Okay, so that's an important point for everybody, if I understand it correctly. So you have this bank essentially of voices, likenesses, but right now it's voices of over 500, probably well over 500, and it will get to much more than that. So you, as an artist, you participate actively that way. You put your voice, you make your voice available, but your voice, if you make it available, cannot be used for training of your AI itself.
Correct.
Okay. I'm going to ask you about what your AI is trained on then, but anyhow, continue on.
The short answer is it's open source audiobooks. It's high quality open source audiobook data. Although for the exact specifics on what content is in there currently, I have to defer to my technical co-founder.
Yeah, I was going to ask you a little bit about that, just the best you can, and then continue on just the SAG, and because that is very big news, but if it's open source model, is there any concern? Like there was just a big case that was one of the federal judges that I just wrote about. It was the Stability AI case, and DeviantArt is a company that has essentially a bank of artists like who participate on DeviantArt, and I can come in as a user and generate new art based on that licensed content library. So they're fully licensed that way, but DeviantArt itself, although it didn't do any of the training of its AI, it integrated Stable Diffusion as the underlying AI model, And so DeviantArt was also brought into this lawsuit for copyright infringement, even though it did not do the training itself. And just last week, and I just wrote about it today, like I said, DeviantArt tried to dismiss the claims against it based on the fact that it was not doing any of the training itself. And the judge said, no, we won't dismiss it as a matter of law. We'll continue on the evidentiary side. So there's that issue, which is a pretty big issue. And so the reason why I bring that up is that if you're using similarly, it sounds like you're only using voices and likenesses that have been consented to, that people have, they've agreed to be part of your pool, your bank of content. But your underlying AI model, since it's open source, is there any concern that there's integration of copyrighted works or name, images, and likenesses that have been scraped without consent?
No, because we've managed the entire scraping process on our side, right? So we know exactly what's in there. It is all audiobooks that have a Creative Commons license that we are able to use, and that's it, full stop.
So it's Creative Commons license?
I believe that's right, yes.
Okay. So as far as you know, and that's a question for you, your own artists who participate, their voices will not be used as part of training. Can they give consent to say yes? Or do you not even ask that question?
We're not asking the question, right? Because our use case is fundamentally on, hey, the model is what the model is currently. What we'd like to do on a go-forward basis is make sure that when we instantiate a digital voice replica, which is the term that we've established with SAG-AFTRA, that talent's fairly compensated for the use of that digital voice replica. And that is our fundamental concern.
Okay. Would they... So SAG-AFTRA definitely takes a position that would be a violation of name, image, likeness if voices and I guess any part of a person's persona is used for underlying training.
Yes, they would.
Okay. Which is, by the way, is a fascinating question when it comes to, as an aside, there's the massive, probably the biggest case that I've seen from a major media company entering into a training deal is News Corp's $250 million deal over 5 years with OpenAI. And it's interesting because, okay, they've made their content all available for use of training, but all the underlying name, image, likeness stuff, all the personalities, all the actors, all the talent, I have no idea, and I follow this pretty closely, very closely. I have no idea how that was handled, and I don't see many people talking about the name, image, likeness issues that come into play, even if a media company agrees, consents, and enters into a license deal.
Yeah, I mean, the News Corp deal specifically, and this is just me guessing, but if I'm OpenAI, I probably want it for a couple of reasons. So one is the ability to make sure that when someone queries ChatGPT, that they're actually getting up-to-date information. So that's probably a big chunk of it.
No question.
And two is just, look, continue to refine whatever news is available of the day available in that model, right? So
no, absolutely. I totally get that. Like, I understand the reason why they would do it, but my question is the fundamental question about a media company entering into a license deal.
Yep.
They didn't go through all their underlying talent deals. There's thousands upon thousands upon thousands. And of course, they didn't go through all those underlying talent deals. So the name, image, likeness issues that we're talking about in relation to what you're doing, it has broad application that I have no idea how the big media companies are thinking about those issues. Because if I were a talent and let's say and I think I've heard Kara Swisher talking about this on, she's part of the Vox Media podcast network, and Vox entered into a training deal. And so they didn't seek her consent, I don't think.
No, I'm sure they didn't. Look, there's probably something in their contract that stipulates that everything that is produced is the product of the company. But then I think you get into a difficult conversation around what is the company owning, right? And what do you own, right? Because the notion that a company can have perpetual use of your likeness, as part of that underlying training data and sell that to someone without compensating you? That feels like a thorny question to me, but it's also not one that Narrative is necessarily trying to take a stand on either way.
Listen, no, totally. I know I've taken us a little bit far afield, but I think for everybody out there, it's kind of a head spinner because there isn't that much discussion about the underlying name, image, likeness issues that come into play when we're talking about training. And this is directly something that you have addressed at Narrative. So, the complexities involved, and that's why it sounds like it took 10 months or many, many months to get to the point where you are. So now the deal has been announced, and congratulations on that.
Thank you.
What is the reaction of the talent community? I would imagine it's a mixed bag.
It's definitely a mixed bag. So I would say that just based on the number of people who have signed up and how rapidly they've signed up, there's clearly a demand for this. I think the general reaction from most folks is acknowledging that AI is probably here to stay. So how do we find an ethical way to work with it? And I'd say that's probably one core group of people. Outside of that, I think there's another camp of folks who are, perpetual never AI folks who want to make sure that it's not used in any kind of relationship to media. I think that's a little bit of a tougher stance, just given how far this technology has progressed. And then I think there's probably a third camp of people who are unsure where this is ultimately going to go, and they're worried about their livelihoods and want to just make sure that they're fairly compensated if they're going to participate in AI at all. So those would be the three broad buckets that I'd put the reactions in.
How do you feel about when somebody asks you, talent come up to you and they have a visceral reaction? How do you feel about, everybody, understandably, there's a, as you were saying, with any new technology, there's understandable trepidation because there will be displacement. Yep. There will be displacement. There are new opportunities, but there's there's displacement with the old traditional model. So how do you respond to somebody who is very much opposed to the idea of allowing just the fundamentals, a service such as your own?
I seek to understand where the fear comes from, right? So I think one of the big reasons why people are afraid of this is because of the notion of perpetual use, right? So that's come up a lot. And that's part of the reason why this has come up a lot is because a few different studios have tried to bake in perpetual use elements into their contracts with talent. Mm-hmm. And so they're afraid of being disintermediated from their own likeness, which I think is a very fair concern. Mm-hmm. The other component that I would call out is, look, most people, when they talk about how am I using my likeness today, they're afraid of getting fully displaced from their own jobs, right? So if I'm a commercial voice actor, I might be worried about having my voice now replace me, which is not necessarily the worst thing if you have fair compensation, right? But you need fair compensation and non-perpetual use in order to instantiate something like that. But I'd say most of the fear comes from the perpetual use element and the lack of compensation. Those are the two biggest drivers. Outside of that, I start thinking about, okay, how do we respond to these folks and tell them where this technology could go, right? So one thing that comes to mind immediately, and we've been talking about this with both talent and agents, has been, look, today, if I upload my voice to Narrative, or not necessarily today, in a couple of weeks, so this is going to be a product feature that we're rolling out, I'll be able to generate advertisements not only in my own voice in the language that I natively speak, but in many different languages, right? So now instead of just having a US voiceover presence, I could have a global voiceover presence. And that's a fundamentally different paradigm.
That's interesting. And yeah, that's very, very interesting. And so when you do roll this out, is it going to be kind of incremental where you have 5 languages and then 15 languages and on? And is that the way you see it going?
We'll probably start with 8 core ones. But yes, ultimately, it'll be a rollout where we have some languages that are very good, some ones that are being worked on in the background. And as they pass a sniff test on our side, we will roll them out.
Yeah. So that's going to be fascinating. So could it be where you write the text copy in English, and even though it's just written in English, you can press a button and it can be spit out into 5 different languages?
You could probably do that, although I don't think we're envisioning it in quite that way. I
Okay.
think what we're envisioning is more of a one-to-one relationship where
Yeah.
I come in as a Spanish language advertiser, put in the copy in Spanish, generate the advertisement in Spanish, and send it to talent to review and approve, maybe with the translation to English if Spanish is not their native language.
Yeah. Understood. Okay. And then that gets into interesting things too. If you're using like, my voice and I'm speaking, my samples are all in English,
Yep.
just and yet you're able to convert it into multiple different languages, but intonations in different languages are, different intonations will lead to different meanings and all that. So like it's a fascinating issue that you have to tackle.
Yes, definitely. And look, that's part of the reason why we allow for unlimited generation on the advertiser side, because you
Yeah.
want to make sure that you're hitting home on that narration that sounds best to you as the advertiser.
Yeah. Okay. Got it. Are there any other cases like that? I think that's really a fascinating one where somebody can now take their voice all around the world. Any other non-obvious use cases?
I mean, I'll just stick to our main use case, which is advertising, right? So it's
Okay.
advertising around the world, and that's where we want to be focused is on the ad generation side of things. There are plenty of other use cases where there are some folks who have talked about dubbing in movies into other languages so that I can watch it in my native language.
Yeah.
I think that's one that we're not taking a stance on one way or another, but you could apply the same thing for video games or whatever, such that you retain the original performance of the people who might have been mainly the main cast in whatever piece of media is produced.
I would imagine things like audiobooks, but that's not part of what you're doing.
We're not focused on that. And
Okay.
there are a few reasons for that. The main one being, look, we think it's a small market and we think advertising is just a better play for us personally.
And so is Narrative's pitch to all kinds of artists, whether anybody who's a member of SAG, but are you looking to also get major talent on board?
It'd be nice if we could. Yes.
Okay. That's the goal. So do you have any names to share?
Not today, but if you look on our website, you'll find a couple of folks who I might call out. So if you're a Star Trek fan, we have the Tim Russ, the person who played Tuvok on Star Trek Voyager. So he's on the platform. We have James Brown, the sports broadcaster. So if you're an NFL fan, he's on the site. Outside of those guys, we've got a couple of other people who have had roles in TV shows. So I'd encourage you to just check out the site.
Yeah, but the bigger the better. Not better, but the goal is to have a very valuable collection of personality.
I think that's right. And the goal is to bring on talent who have unique audiences, right? So
Yeah.
the example that we can maybe use here is, who is your favorite actor or personality or something to that effect?
That's a really good question. I think somebody who's one of my favorite actors. For lack of a better word, a better one, I'll just say Tom Cruise.
Okay.
An obvious one.
Right. So let's say it's Tom Cruise, right? And let's say I'm not as big of a Tom Cruise fan as you are.
Yeah.
If you hear a voice in an advertisement in Tom Cruise's voice telling you, hey, I think you'd be interested in X, Y, and Z product, that advertisement will mean more to you than it will to me.
Yeah, for sure.
And that's the baked in thought, right? So what we're really after is talent who have unique audiences, such that when an advertiser creates an ad and sends it to that audience, it has the highest possible effect, and that effect being higher return on ad spend.
Yeah. Okay. Got it. And in terms of competitors, 11 Labs, do you consider them to be a competitor?
I'd say that they're adjacent. I don't know if they're a direct competitor. And I say that for a couple of reasons. So one is, to date, their use case has been primarily focused on content generation on YouTube is probably the main one. And then outside of that, they're trying to get into narrated news and a few other things. They haven't really gotten into advertising specifically, and I think that's because it's a thornier space. So if we carve out the different use cases, I'd say we're laser focused on advertising, and I would say they are not.
Okay. And the reason why I mentioned 11 Labs, just because I've tracked them for a long time, they are part of the Disney Accelerator. I think they have over $1 billion valuation now. I believe they do.
They do.
So it's a unicorn. And getting into just valuations, not your valuation, but who are your investors? And, as much as you can talk about that, how much you've raised today, what's public, all that kind of good stuff.
We are much smaller. So today we've only raised a friends and family round. We are actively raising as we speak a seed round.
Okay, very good. And so it's friends and family only. And how many people do you have within the company right now?
It's just me and my co-founder. So we're much, much smaller.
Okay. And then the engineering team is where?
So originally we brought on a team for a period of time that was US based.
Yeah.
But ultimately we had to skinny down to just me and my co-founder. And
Okay.
that part of that was we ended up building a bunch of the infrastructure up front, and getting an agreement with the union took time. So we needed to make sure that we had enough runway.
Listen, a true entrepreneur, that for sure.
Sure.
I've been there for the very beginning of a very, very small company. And like I said, I've heard of Narrative. I've heard the name for quite some time. So good for you for two people and a small team building a brand that is known out there, and to be able to get SAG to go into this kind of a deal and enter and also support it and the announcement in the marketplace. Like, that's a big deal.
Appreciate that. I think my response to that will always be there's more to do. So,
of course,
yeah,
you're an entrepreneur. So there's
exactly
more, there's always more to do. So, okay. Speaking of, just a little bit about yourself and your journey to get to where you are. You mentioned a little bit, but a little bit more than that.
Yeah, I'm happy to go over my professional background. So I started my career at Bain & Company as a strategy consultant in the Chicago office. Looked at many different things during my tenure there, although in my last year, I became a product manager for Bain. They were going through this process at the time of figuring out to what extent they wanted to bring historically third-party tools in-house. So over the course of 9 months, we ended up building from scratch a merger integration tool, all the way from ideation to getting the first set of pilots on board and getting it fully coded and implemented. So that tool is called Signal, if you want to check it out today. And I don't know if I'm allowed to say how much revenue it hosts from Bain & Company side, but it's pretty substantial. Following that, I went to Bain Capital for 2 years, working as an investment associate, in a group called Partnership Strategies. And what Partnership Strategies does is try and make investments uncorrelated to the equities market, but that generate an equity-like return. I'm happy to dive further into each of those.
No, that's fine.
Yeah.
But that's good. And so what made you then leave the comforts of being within a company the size of a Bain?
So I've always personally been, at least in my 20s, directed by this notion that this is the decade to learn. So I came up with this framework when I was a consultant that there are probably 3 or 4 different business toolkits you can get. So one's an investing toolkit, a strategic toolkit, and there's an operational/leadership toolkit. And on the operational leadership side, I thought that the best way to achieve that would be to start my own thing. I think the last 2 years has shown me that that was probably true, although I don't know if I was ready for as much turbulence as there is in that journey. But that was my framework. And so I knew that following Bain Capital, there was just more for me to learn, and thought that the startup journey was the best way to go about learning.
So how would you compare the stress levels amongst between being part of a Bain as a young associate and an entrepreneur where it's the great wide open?
They're different. I would say that the aperture of your vision on, hey, what is my role and responsibility, that can dictate how much stress you have in any given thing, right? So I remember being very stressed at Bain & Company, trying to get up the learning curve and get better at my job. Same thing happened at Bain Capital. But I would say the key difference is at a certain point, that stress goes away as you get more competent at whatever role it is that you're doing. Whereas if you're an entrepreneur, you can try and do several different things and have them not work. And that stress is just pervasive, I will say. So it's very different. It's pointed like in the moment stress in those more corporate roles versus more pervasive stress outside of it.
Which is more fulfilling? Come on now. Tell everybody out there who's deciding a life between being in a large institution versus going off into the great unknown.
For me, I can only answer for myself, right? So for me, the startup is more fulfilling. And part of that is, look, I feel myself getting better and smarter at this job now, where there's this great Steve Jobs clip. If you look on YouTube, him talking to a room full of MBAs, and he asked them, how many of you like worked in industry, right? And how many of you worked in consulting? And he says, oh, that's way too many people who answered that I worked in consulting. Yeah. And part of the reason for that, and what he starts talking about, is how you're not battle tested if you stay in that role, right? So you make recommendations, but if you never follow through on the recommendations, you never learn how to actually get better and make them work. So he ends up using this analogy where it's like you see the world in a two-dimensional slice, when in reality it's three-dimensional. So for me, it's more fulfilling the entrepreneurial journey, because I'm learning now the difference between making a recommendation and actually seeing that recommendation through to a point where it actually works. Or if it doesn't work, quickly pivoting and trying to do something else.
Yeah, no, there's no question. As an entrepreneur, there aren't layers to go through. You make a decision, move on, and as they say, fail fast if it doesn't work. Okay, so 2 last questions. What is apart from your own, what is the coolest or most impressive generative AI tool that you have seen?
Ooh, that one's tough. I mean, Sora is kind of mind-blowing. I haven't seen too much of it, but the clips that I've seen generated are kind of astounding. So I might just call out OpenAI Sora. Outside of that, though, I don't know. I'm a big user of ChatGPT in general, and use it for a bunch of my day-to-day work. So in terms of most directly impacting my day-to-day, it probably is just ChatGPT.
Okay.
And I know that's kind of a boring answer, but
but how? Okay, so how do you most use it if you use it so actively on a daily basis?
I use it for a bunch of my internal writing, right? So when I'm generating, not necessarily press releases, but things that are important for a narrative in terms of dictating where we go, our vision, potential outreach notes, things like that, or even using it as a thought partner to think through, hey, what are all the different variables that I should consider with X, Y, and Z thing? I can use it to bounce ideas off of. And that can be incredibly helpful when trying to shape a story or shape a thought process or anything to that effect.
Yeah, very good. And then final question for you. What do you say to those out there who say, generative AI has been overhyped. We're in a bubble. We're in a bubble right now.
Look, I'm no economic expert. My take is it could be true. I think part of it is there's been a lot of speculation over how powerful things like AI agents will be, in terms of being able to mimic what a person does in a company. And I think a bunch of the speculation has been that AI agents will be able to take over a person's role more directly, and we haven't really seen that come to fruition. There are still things that are uniquely complicated that people need to take on. So given that, we could very well be in a circumstance where all this investment doesn't necessarily yield that fully agentic AI agent. I'm probably misusing the word agent here a couple times, but point is, like, it's not fully baked yet. And until it is fully baked, we will not see the dividends from that payoff. But again, I'm no economics expert, and this is coming from a pure layman's perspective. I'm focused on advertising and talent.
But if you're a betting man, do you think that 5 years from now, 10 years from now, people will look back and say, no, there was no overinvestment here, or yes, there was overinvestment here? Just in general, in the world of generative AI.
I don't know. I don't know is the short answer.
Come on, you're an entrepreneur, make a bet. I'll be bold. I'll say that this is not a bubble. It may be a short-term bubble for venture capitalists who are trying to invest in certain companies who are competing with the big guys, because it's going to be tough. It's going to be very tough. But I think long-term generative AI is going to transform so many different things in our worlds that we have no idea about. That's my feeling.
Look, I think that's probably right. And you could make you could draw an analogy, right? So the .com era, I'm sure people have made this analogy before, where there were a ton of investments that were made into it, And it did take time for all of those to pay off, but 2002 is very different from 2007 when you have something like a Facebook come out, right?
Yeah.
So I think yes, it will pay off at some point. And the investments that we're making now are basically the early innings of figuring out what's got enough staying power. So what will actually be there. I'm excited to see how it plays out is maybe the thing I'll say.
Okay. So I have one more question, actually. So getting back to your core business, which is this bank of this talent of what you call digital voice replicas.
Yep.
Replicas. Some I think call it like digital or voice cloning, but that's not the way you phrase it. Digital voice replicas. Who are some of your wish list voices that you would like to have talent-wise?
I mean, look, I'm sure that mine would be the same as plenty of folks. So if I could get Morgan Freeman or James Earl Jones or someone.
I was going to say James Earl Jones.
I mean, who wouldn't want to have Darth Vader available to license for an advertisement? But look, that's my dream list. I think I'd be more than happy by just bringing on talent now who are voiceover artists who have really distinctive and good voices who might be able to resonate with a particular audience. So my wish list is definitely different than what I think we will have in the near term.
Got it. Okay, well, very good. So Ben Gottdiener, thank you so much for joining. So everybody check out Narrativ, Narrativ, no E. TIV. And again, the reason why Ben's on is because the ethically trained model that he has, unlike many others that are out there in related spaces. And, I like calling attention to the fact that you're doing that. Good for you for doing that, especially with such a small team. And for people out there, just go check it out. No matter how you feel about generative AI, like we were talking about, it is here. And so it's understandably daunting, but the best way is to try to get your arms around it by just understanding what it's capable of and then determining whether you want to use it or not. That's up to everybody. But again, Ben, thanks for joining. Again, this is the Brain Podcast, and look forward to seeing just what you have next.
Thank you, Peter. And I'm excited to share.
Yes. Good to see you.